So far in North America, there has not been much of an appetite for a pragmatic electric vehicle. Instead, manufacturers and shoppers alike have been gravitating towards EVs with wicked fast 0 to 60 times, firm suspension tunes for excellent handling dynamics, and of course, wicked fast DC fast charge rates, even though the average consumer doesn't DC fast charge on a regular basis. Subaru, however, went in a very different direction with the Solterra. This is, of course, the close sister ship to the Toyota BZ4X, but the Solterra is certainly the prettier sister. No matter how we might try and logic our way into why we bought a particular vehicle, there's a strong emotional component to every new car purchase. And that means it is a bit of an uphill battle for something like the Solterra, where the numbers just aren't as flashy as the competition's numbers. But it does fit the peak of the bell curve really nicely. The reality is, the average new car shopper does not drive more than 60 to 70 miles a day, and they don't road trip on a regular basis. So the range figures of the Solterra should be just fine. The average new EV shopper also does almost all of their charging at home or at the office, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem either when it comes to the charge speeds of this vehicle. Now, admittedly, there's plenty of room on the shoulders of the bell curve, so if you do need more than 220 miles of range, if you do need to DC fast charge in under an hour, which is actually a pretty low bar to jump over, then you might want to take a look at something else. If, however, you like the look of the Solterra, you like the Subaru brand, and you are more of a pragmatic shopper, there's a decent amount to like in this, especially if you want something a bit more off-road capable. But let's talk about the styling first. The front end definitely looks like a Subaru blended with a little bit of Toyota, because of course the Solterra and the BZ4X were co-designed by Toyota and Subaru, but the majority of the engineering of the structure was done by Toyota. Subaru did the tuning of the all-wheel drive system, and of course they designed the front bumper, which is a bazillion times more attractive than the BZ4X. Over here we have full LED multi-module headlights, definitely very Subaru in style there. LED fog lights below, and then they've morphed the Subaru grille into this somewhat controversial design over here on the side that we find in the BZ4X, but without the 50% more raccoon style that we find in that model. Even though Subaru's sales have exploded in North America over the last few years, they're still a relatively small company, and that's why they teamed up with Toyota to design the Solterra. Of course, it doesn't hurt that Toyota owns 20% of Subaru, and that's also why we find some of these Toyota-like design cues like the taillight that wraps around to the side and then splits off there. But we definitely have a lot of Subaru going on here with the sort of plastic cladding around the wheel wells and the 8.3 inches of ground clearance. This has about the same kind of ground clearance we find in a Forester or an Outback, and that really is one of the big reasons you might want to choose this over a Mach-E or an Ioniq 5. Depending on the competitor we're talking about, you'll find 40 to 60% more ground clearance in the Solterra. That is also part of why the range is a little bit lower than the competition, because ground clearance has an impact on aerodynamics and highway range. The more ground clearance you have, the lower your highway range will be. Out back we find full LED taillight modules with, of course, amber turn signals and a really sloping rear window. That's obviously a nod to aerodynamics, but it does mean that we have a lot less cargo practicality than in the Subaru Forester, which is roughly the same size on the outside. Range and charging are two areas where the Solterra falls behind the competition, and significantly behind the competition, it's worth noting. The longest range version gives you just 228 miles of range. Keep in mind all-wheel drive is standard. That sounds bad, but keep in mind that the base all-wheel drive version of the Mach-E is actually right around that same neighborhood. The model we're driving here, 222 miles of range. The bigger problem for me is the onboard AC Level 2 charger. It's rated for 6.6 kilowatts, and that means that if you take this to completely empty and you want to get completely full, it's going to take about 9.5 hours. Most of the competition at this point has an 11 kilowatt charger on board, so it's going to be significantly faster. The DC fast charge times, they're also somewhat similar to those base competitors. Keep in mind that a base Mustang Mach-E is not going to charge much faster than this. It's about 120 kilowatts peak. This is about 100 kilowatts peak, so it is still slower, but not as much slower as you might think. And something like the Kona EV or a Niro EV, they're going to be right in this same neighborhood, actually a little bit slower than this as far as DC fast charge speeds go. On the other hand, an Ioniq 5 or an EV6 are significantly faster. You can go 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes, and that 70% charge is going to get you significantly more miles than a 70% charge of this battery, which in our testing took about 55 minutes, so about 3 times longer for less range. If you're an existing Subaru owner, you'll notice that the front seat design is definitely different than the average Subaru in North America, but I still found it pretty comfortable. We have a two-way adjustable lumbar support and a manually adjustable tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, but kind of a peculiar position. It's a relatively small wheel, and in order to see the instrument cluster, which I'll show you in a bit, you do have to have the steering wheel relatively low, which kind of doesn't go with the feel of being somewhat higher off the ground. This certainly gives you more of a real SUV feel as far as the seating position versus something like a EV6 or an Ioniq 5, but the steering wheel ends up relatively low. Rear legroom is pretty similar to a lot of EVs. I have a decent amount of room behind that front seat, comfortably adjusted for me, but you will find a bit more room in the Subaru Forester. Scooting over to the right side, this seat's all the way back in its tracks. You can see I have a little bit less, maybe about 3.5 inches of legroom there. And the rear seats are very reclined. This actually has a very relaxed seating position. Even if I put these rear seats in their more upright position, you still end up with kind of a lean back that is a little bit different than we find in, say, a Forester. Headroom, also a little bit lower than in the Forester, although pretty generous. I have about 1 inch of headroom left, and this has a dual pane moonroof setup. So one pane right over here over the rear passengers, one right up there. We have a center shoulder belt that comes out of the seat itself, thank the heavens, rather than out of the ceiling. That means it's going to be a lot easier to install a child seat in the middle and not have it canted to one side or the other. As far as child seats go, we have latch anchors for the outboard seating positions only, and the seats fold in a 60-40 fashion. As we see in a decent number of EVs, the extra wheelbase and the extra legroom that we find in the Solterra really means that it's going to be a lot easier to put some of the larger rear-facing child seats in here. As you can see, we have a Kleck rear-facing infant seat. That fits no problem with that front passenger seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. There's even enough room to install a larger Kiko convertible child seat. This particular model is forward-facing and rear-facing and suitable for kids up to 65 pounds. This is definitely one of the larger convertible seats. That's thanks to the Solterra not just having a lot of legroom, but also having a pretty wide bench. You can see right here in the middle that even these larger seats don't interfere with the seat belt and the seat latch mechanism. So if you had someone skinny, I guess they could sit there in between these two seats, or of course you could put one seat in the middle and put an adult on the side. And installing a child seat in the center location is going to be made easier by the shoulder belt coming out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling or out of the side of the cargo area like we find in a lot of Subarus. Not surprisingly, you'll find more cargo room in the Forester, mainly because of its very upright rear hatch that really gives you a much squarer cargo area in the back. In here we find just over 20 cubic feet of cargo space, so even though this is about the same size as the Forester on the outside, cargo capacity is going to be significantly more limited. Also, under the load floor, there's no spare tire. This is one area where I have to say I'm surprised that Subaru didn't make some changes, because they probably could have put a compact spare back there if they'd really worked at it a bit. Instead, we have this foam divider where you can put your EV charge cord, something like that, and then you can lower the cargo load floor down to a lower height if you want a little bit more storage height. All right, let's take a look around the interior and talk about the good, the bad, and the just plain funky. Up here we have a digital rear view mirror. Don't worry, you can flip that over and get a traditional mirror if you'd rather do that. Behind there we have a single camera setup for the autonomous braking and active safety systems because this uses a radar sensor for adaptive cruise control. They borrowed the safety hardware out of the Toyota lineup, so this does not use the same EyeSight hardware that we find in other Subarus. Over here we find the controls for the powered shade on what appears to be a dual pane moonroof, but it is in fact one sheet of glass, and I can actually reach my hand through there and you can see my fingers come out on the other side. This is just a structural beam right there in the middle of everything. I am surprised that they didn't give this just a single big sheet of glass, or at least have the front section open if they needed that beam right there. Seems like a strange design decision for me. Over here we have sun visors for the driver and front passenger with a sliding extension. The entire sun visor does not slide out. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable head restraints. Here's a better view of that Kleck rear-facing infant seat right there behind the passenger seat. Now, speaking of the seat itself, this is definitely a very Toyota design. The headrest, the shoulders on the seat, the upholstery, everything. This is very, very similar to what we find in a number of Toyota models. These seats are both heated and ventilated, which is a nice touch. We have moderate bolstering for the seat back and seat bottom cushions. I did find them really nice to actually hold you into the seat, but I don't think that larger folks would have too much of a trouble with this design. I think that they're just wide enough for a lot of folks to be happy with that. Moving over to the front doors, we find a combination of hard and soft plastics. Soft plastics, generally speaking, on the upper section of the door, like the very top of the door panel there and this soft touch armrest, but logically harder plastics below. Now, you'll notice as we look around the interior that most of the switches and buttons and knobs have a very Toyota feel to them, including the infotainment system right here in the middle of the dash. But before we get to that, we should just explain the dashboard here, because we have this screen over here on the driver's side. This is the instrument cluster, no separate heads-up display. We have a very, very square steering wheel. I think this is a little bit out of place in this interior personally. And then we have a very slim dashboard, and there are definitely pros and cons to this particular setup. Starting over here on the passenger side, we have fabric on the dashboard, which really dresses things up, but you'll notice no glove compartment down here, and we don't get those heated knee bolster areas that we find in the BZ4X. According to the designers, they did this so that way the dashboard could have a really slim and sexy feel to it, but it does mean, where do you put your registration? Where do you actually put your gloves if you don't have a glove box? And you know, they're just right here in this center console area, along with your registration and your insurance information, etc., which means you don't have as much space for other things. In fact, actually, a lack of storage space is something that we should talk about here, because there isn't quite as much as you might think. There is this under console storage area there. You can see I have a sunglasses case there, but there's not an extraordinary amount of storage capacity. You could put very small items up here in this little storage nook, but it's really just designed for pens and pencils. Aside from that, your only option really is just the pockets on the doors. Going back to the middle of the dashboard, we find a large touchscreen infotainment system in the middle. There are two different sizes of LCDs. If you get the base Solterra, then we find a smaller 8-inch version of this same software, and the software is Toyota software, so it feels very much like every other Toyota out there, like the BZ4X. There are some pros and cons. I find that the look and feel of this system is a little bit more modern than what we see in the average Subaru currently, and I do like the fact that the navigation system is internet connected. We also have the internet connected assistant built into the vehicle, so you can ask it questions, you can voice command it to change temperatures, things like that, but it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the Subaru lineup. I do, however, like the fact that CarPlay occupies the entire screen, and I generally prefer this horizontal layout to the vertical layout we find in most Subarus. Below that, we find controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control and a combination of physical and touch buttons. So touch buttons over here for the heated and ventilated seats. There's also an auto mode, which is a nice touch. And then touch and physical buttons for the climate control. There's also physical buttons for the volume up and down and power for that infotainment system. We then have the power button there, dimmer controls over there for the instrument cluster. Down here we have some additional controls like the one pedal drive mode button there, electric parking brake, auto brake hold. This is the shifter. Put your foot on the brake and then you press down on this ring and then rotate around for drive. Park is that button there. Over here we have the drive mode selector, 360-degree camera button, automated parking button, and then an X mode button, because Subaru is responsible for all of the off-road capability of the Solterra, and interestingly the BZ4X as well. From a functional standpoint, I appreciate the location of this screen, because it's trying to replace an instrument cluster and a heads-up display with one single LCD, and I think it does that job pretty well. By having that display so close to the edge of the windshield, its location is actually pretty similar to the average heads-up display, only it's less expensive and it's not going to mean an expensive windshield replacement should that ever need to happen in the future. Also, it's cheaper to have just one LCD, as you can see. But from the passenger perspective, it does end up being rather strange looking over here, especially from this angle. You can see the steering column appears really long. It has this sort of diving board-like thing right there, and then it also has this big plastic skirt around there that kind of billows around when you're adjusting the steering wheel. A number of passengers have mentioned that, and it's something that I didn't really notice until I was on the passenger side of the vehicle. Now, taking a look at the screen itself, it is running very similar software to what we find in the Prius and, of course, the BZ4X, and it's mounted to the dashboard in a very interesting way. It's actually mounted back there, but then we have these big arms or wings or whatever you want to call them, and you can actually see the fabric dashboard through there. It is definitely a very, very stylized look, and whether or not that style is right for you, I would say that's really going to be personal preference. But again, you're supposed to be looking at that display like that over the top of the steering wheel. On the column, we have the driver monitoring system, and then you'll notice that the wheel, it is definitely unlike any Subaru wheel we've seen before. It is definitely very, very square, flat bottom, flat top, rather squared off sides as well, and it's really obvious as you start rotating it around. The wheel's also relatively small in diameter, and the controls are fairly large, so it does mean that things feel a little bit tight around the fingers sometimes. Over here we have the controls for that multifunction display, as well as volume up, down, and a voice command button. Over here we have track forward, backward, controls for the adaptive cruise control system there, and a mode button for the infotainment system. Over here on this side of the dashboard, we have things like the auto high beam control, button for that power hatch in the back, And yes, very, very Toyota window switches. Now here's a good time to talk about the one thing that I dislike about this interior that I don't think is really a style thing, and it's the shiny black plastic. This is certainly going to scratch pretty easily over time. And even though this model only has about 900 miles on it, there are actually already a decent number of scratches on the center console as well, because this has that same shiny black plastic everywhere. Under this little lid with kind of a translucent theme there, we find the Qi wireless charging mat. Wireless charging is optional, but we do have wireless CarPlay in this vehicle as well, which is kind of a nice touch. Two really big cup holders there, absolutely no problem accommodating the large takeout drinks. And then there's that storage cubby I showed you earlier. All right, it's time to get the Solterra out on the road. And when we do, you will certainly notice this does not feel like the average Subaru currently on sale in the US. Obviously, some of that has to do with the Toyota DNA, but a lot of it has to do simply with the electric drivetrain. Just over 210 horsepower doesn't sound too exciting, but the 0 to 60 numbers are actually pretty solid. This model went 0 to 60 in 6.6 seconds. That's just a little bit slower than the last Solterra that I drove, but actually a little bit quicker than the last BZ4X that I drove as well. Acceleration in this vehicle actually sort of belies the power number, I guess you could say, or the power numbers belie the acceleration figures, because this definitely feels peppier than you might have expected. You don't have to wait for a transmission to shift. If you're already going, say, about 30 to 40 miles an hour and you romp on the throttle, you get much more instant acceleration than you'd get in an Outback or a Forester or any other Subaru currently on sale, thanks to the electric nature of the drivetrain. However, if you're starting from a stop, I'll just come back down here to a stop here, and you romp on the throttle, you'll notice that they do take a while to dial power all the way up. We don't get all 200 some odd horsepower until we're going about 35 or 40 miles an hour. That is a little bit slower of a ramp than we find in some electric vehicles, and it does mean that right off the line, this doesn't feel quite as peppy as I think it could. Coming in at 125 feet from 60 miles an hour to 0, the braking score is solidly respectable for a modern EV, but the rest of the nature of the Solterra comes across as a little bit conflicted. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. Let's start with this steering wheel and the handling nature and handling behavior of the vehicle. The square wheel definitely looks cool, but its small diameter and the square nature of the wheel just seem at odds with the mission of the Solterra, especially if you're on a road like this where you might find yourself frequently turning the steering wheel up to 90 degrees or more and then returning to center. It just feels odd. Now, aside from that, the handling in the Solterra is definitely solid, but not where we would see something like the EV6 or the Ioniq 5 or, of course, a Tesla Model Y. That's partially because of the tire size, narrower tires here on the Solterra, and also because of the mission of this vehicle. As I said, this is designed to go further off the beaten path. It's designed to take you and your kayak or your skis or your bicycle or your boat or whatever closer to that trailhead, closer to where the fun is. And there are certainly going to be trade-offs with that. If you want 8.3 inches of ground clearance, you have to give up some handling ability. On the other hand, you gain ride quality because we have more ground clearance, we have a vehicle that was designed for a little bit more rough and tumble action, there's more room for the suspension to soak up bumps out on the road. And this easily has one of the most comfortable suspension tunes for an EV in North America. You'll really notice that on poorly paved road surfaces like this where there are lots of potholes. This suspension not only doesn't become upset over the potholes, you feel those potholes an awful lot less in the cabin. And that's going to be really important if you do want to take your EV more mild off-roading. But then again, there is that sort of conflicted thing going on here as well, and that would be the range in the Solterra. Averaging about 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour, this is almost exactly the same as the score that I got in the BZ4X, and that means that you should get, logically, a little bit over 220 miles of real-world range as long as the weather's good. But 220 miles of range is not enough to really go to some of those off-road places and then still be able to get home unless there was off-road charging there as well. And I haven't found too many off-road charging locations outside of some of the Rivian destination chargers. On the other hand, the Solterra is very quiet. I measured 70 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this the equal of the BZ4X and right in the thick of things with the competition. This is certainly quieter than the average Subaru. The average Subaru has actually a little bit less sound deadening than I might like, and generally speaking, the design of those vehicles, the boxer engine, etc., just leads to more engine noise in the cabin, and in here, things are very, very quiet. The biggest thing that I've come away with after spending a week in the Solterra is that this is an incredibly easy to live with vehicle. For the average shopper that's not driving too many miles a day, not regularly road tripping to the Outback, this is going to be a fantastic option. It's quiet, it's comfortable, it's relatively efficient. There's enough quirk to make your friends smile or laugh or giggle, whatever it is that your friends might be doing. But I have to admit, if there was one thing that I would want to change on the Solterra, it would actually be the range figure. I actually think the acceleration, the braking, and the handling scores are exactly where they need to be, but this also, I think, needs at least 100 miles more range, or faster DC fast charging, and it is all because of the off-road mission of the Solterra. This is significantly more comfortable on an off-road trail. I did that at the launch event of the Solterra. Of course, I'm driving out here on these poorly paved road surfaces and the gravel road that I live on all the time. It is a very easy to live with vehicle in those situations, and I love the symmetrical all-wheel drive setup in this vehicle where we have a nearly identical motor up front and in the back. It really does make this feel very sure-footed. And because of the way Subaru decided to program this system, it's always trying to balance power 50-50 front and rear. They're not taking the more economical approach that, say, Hyundai and Kia are by mechanically disconnecting the front axle, because Subaru really wanted this to have that all-time sure-footed all-wheel drive feel. And they've really accomplished that with the Solterra. The downside, again, simply is if you do plan on taking this to that state park or that national park, or you want to do something on BLM land where you're really out there in the back of Beyond, you know, it's going to take you 100 miles to get there if you live close to one. And then you're going to consume 100 or 200 miles of range at the park, depending on what you want to do. And that means that you're already in a power deficit versus the kind of power this vehicle has on hand, unless you have the ability to charge there. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. And now let's run through the pricing and see how the pricing stacks up.
Let's hit the pause button here for just 1 second. Between the time that we filmed this review and now, Subaru has released a few important changes for 2024. Pricing holds the line, so we're going to be talking about 2024 pricing a little bit later in the video. But most importantly, we receive faster DC charging for 2024. This is a combination of software and apparently some hardware changes as well, mainly relating to battery pack heating ability. So the DC fast charge time, 10% to 80%, gets a pretty significant drop to 35 minutes, and Subaru says that cold weather charging especially has been improved, whether we're talking about DC charging or AC charging. So depending on exactly where and how you're charging the vehicle, it could be up to an hour and a half faster charging than last year. The only other major change is that we now receive a hands-free driving system that is capable of driving the vehicle without you touching the steering wheel below 25 miles an hour. So basically think traffic jams out on the open highway. Aside from that, the only changes are a slight reshuffling of features. For instance, we now have the heated steering wheel in the limited trim, and we have ventilated seats in the top-end touring trim. Let's get back to it. As promised, let's talk about 2024 pricing. The Solterra is going to start at $46,340. It's basically the same price as last year. That gets you the base premium model, which is going to be the cheapest one to lease and the one that you're going to see a lot of deals on out there. According to my brief search, it does appear that maybe 20% of the models on dealer lots are the premium trim, so if you're really looking for that good deal, you shouldn't have too much of a problem finding one. The next step up from there is the limited trim for $49,840. This gives you the larger LCD that you saw in this video. If you don't get this trim, then you get a smaller 8-inch screen running essentially the same software. You also get the upgraded Harman Kardon audio system, the power driver's seat, the StarTex upholstery. It is imitation leather. It's not real leather in case you're worrying about that. The newly available heated steering wheel, LED fog lights, and a 360-degree camera system. If you want everything in your next Solterra, that's going to be the touring trim at $53,340. That's going to get you the ventilated seats, the ambient lighting, and of course the panoramic moonroof. Bear in mind that depending on which EV we're talking about, lease rates could be up to 50 to 75% of sales volume. So a huge number of shoppers out there really are considering leasing, and if that's you, then you should know that the Solterra is actually one of the cheapest vehicles in this segment. If you'd rather buy, that's going to be 0% for 72 months on the financing deal, so lots and lots of deals going on the Subaru lot. Now, how does that stack up? Well, that's the important thing. First, let's obviously talk about the elephant in the room. That's the Tesla Model Y. Now, the Model Y is going to be more expensive, but you're going to get a lot more for it. The all-wheel drive model starts at $49,380, including destination. But there's a big asterisk. As long as your income is in the appropriate adjusted gross income range, you'll get a $7,500 tax credit as a point of sale rebate on the vehicle. So it's actually going to lower down your finance and your lease costs, and that could put it up to $5,000 less expensive than the Subaru. This is obviously not just the biggest competitor, it's the toughest competitor as well. The Model Y is going to give you really fast acceleration, 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds, 300 miles of range, native NACS charging, of course, native access to the supercharger network, etc., the dealership-free experience, all of that's going to go on there. It's also going to give you a really roomy cabin, the front trunk, the heat pump, etc., etc., etc. Really, the main advantage for the Subaru is the 8.3 inches of clearance, the fact that the moonroof will open if you want it to. We do get CarPlay, and of course, if you want to take your roof tent on your EV and go camping, it has a rated roof tent load that we don't find in the Model Y. But to be perfectly honest, for most folks, the Model Y is probably going to be a better fit. Now, if you are looking at a Subaru instead of a Model Y, probably you're thinking, I don't want a Tesla. So let's talk about the non-Tesla options. Obviously, the elephant in this room has to be the Ford Mustang Mach-E. It's been on sale for a while, and Ford is really trying to replicate Tesla's formula. We have 2 different battery packs, a bunch of different performance options, and previously the Mach-E got the tax credit. But important for 2024, it doesn't anymore. And that means it's actually about the same price as the Solterra. In fact, actually, when you really look at the numbers, the Mach-E has a lot of numbers that are very similar to the Subaru and, of course, the related Toyota. Quick plug for our merch. If you're interested in a BZ4X, the ultimate driving utensil shirt, you'll find those over on the merch store. But at any rate, back into these vehicles. Common complaints for the Solterra and the BZ4X are the range isn't great, the DC fast charging speed isn't great, the price tag is high. Well, guess what? The Mach-E standard range all-wheel drive select trim is $45,390. So about $1,000 apart from the Subaru. For that range, for that money, you get 2 miles of range, 230 miles versus 228. You do get the big screen in the dashboard. You get slightly faster AC charging. It'll peak at 11 kilowatts. DC charging, it's actually going to be a little bit slower than the Solterra, though. That's the key thing to remember about that base battery pack. Doesn't charge very quickly. It's 38 minutes, 10% to 80%, and the Solterra recently got a drop, so it's only going to take 35 minutes. I mean, we're still talking about a reasonable DC fast charge time for only about 200 miles of range, but, you know, they're pretty much pretty similar there. Also somewhat similar is the Volkswagen ID4, sort of. Volkswagen is trying to make the ID4 kind of a regular Volkswagen that happens to be electric, sort of like the Solterra. If we want all-wheel drive, the cheapest trim there is going to be $50,190 because you have to get the Pro trim with all-wheel drive. But it does get the tax credit. That's the big thing for the ID4. So right there off the top, you're going to get $7,500 off, and that brings it down to $42,680. It's actually right about the same price that we find in the Tesla lineup. For that money, you're going to get 263 miles of range, so a little bit more range than we find in the Solterra. You'll get DC fast charging that's about the same, maybe a little bit faster depending on exactly which model you're talking about. We get a bigger LCD. We get the 13-inch LCD standard in that model, ambient lighting, 20-inch alloys, and importantly, 335 horsepower, because we are talking about the new motors for 2024 in the ID4. And of course, the ID4 is made in the US. That is why it gets the tax credit. I would say bottom line, the Solterra in a vacuum is a perfectly good EV. And actually outside of that vacuum, it's still a great deal as long as we're talking about the base models and we're talking about leasing. I have to admit, in the process of working on the pricing setup for the Solterra, I was there Googling around and I thought to myself, gosh, you know, $329 a month for a lease, or if you could find a 2023 model year hanging out on a dealer lot, $240 a month, zero down for a lease plus taxes. That is a really inexpensive vehicle. And there was a hot second where I thought, let's just lease one. I have no idea why I thought that, because I absolutely do not need another car. But that's really the big advantage for the Solterra. The other advantage really is that it is seemingly designed for exactly my demographic. I live out in the woods. It has a lot of ground clearance. It feels and behaves a lot like a regular Subaru, to be perfectly honest, in terms of its all-wheel drive capability, its winter traction, gravel traction, etc. If you're looking for an EV to take to the ski resorts, to just go camping in, you know, a little woodsy action, something like that, this is going to be a great fit. The problem is the range. It has the range to get you to, you know, somewhere near the back of Beyond, maybe not quite back there, but beyond somewhere. But does it have the range to get you back from the back of Beyond if you can't charge when you're at the campsite. That's the tricky part. Now, the Solterra does not have the same kind of vampire drain that we find in the other adventure brand out there, Rivian, of course. And that's my bigger problem with Rivian is you may calculate the range out and you say I can get from A to B and I can get from B to A, no problem. But 2 weeks there off the grid, it's going to use a reasonable amount of battery, even not using it as your camp base point. The Subaru, on the other hand, it's going to drain very much like a regular vehicle. It's very, very efficient when the ignition is turned off, and as long as you're not using the air conditioning, etc., you don't have to worry about how much battery power is being consumed on a daily basis. You do, however, have to worry about how do I get back home? And if that destination especially is in the mountains, then maybe it can only really realistically be 60 or 70 miles away from the last DC fast charge station where you could really get it completely full, drive it there, drive it back, charge it back up, and then drive home. That's really my only major complaint. But I have to admit, again, I love the big cargo area. It's pretty roomy inside. I like the look. I like the behavior. And the price tag, that is really reasonable. So if you're looking for an electric commuter vehicle, I would say Solterra is not a bad option on your list. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. But I also have to say I would probably just buy the Model Y. See all of you later.